The Hidden History of Pacific Islanders. Hey guys, I'm Brian Osborne, speaker and writer with Answers in Genesis, here with Dr. Nathaniel Jeetson, also a speaker with the ministry, also a scientist and researcher here with Answers in Genesis. And we're looking at his book called Traced, which is really, in a real sense, the new Rosetta Stone of human history, kind of figuring out where all the dots fit together, connecting it all back to Adam and Eve and showing how biblical history is confirmed by real science. We've gone through multiple episodes now, looking at lots of really fascinating things. In the last few episodes, we've seen the Middle Eastern, kind of the lost civilization of the Middle East, connecting that dot. What about the Indus Valley? And then what about the East Asians, kind of pulling all those things together? And we have some amazing answers. And then also at the same time, with amazing answers, new questions are raised. And so, of course, as we mentioned often, we'd love to get your help on this research. I'm sure he'll mention that later on as well. But in this particular episode, looking at the Pacific Islanders, connecting those dots to genetics and biblical history, this is going to be awesome and fantastic. Dr. Nathaniel Jeetson, it is all yours.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to say to our viewers that you're in for some surprises. Of all the peoples on the planet, the genetic history of the Pacific Islanders is some of the most counterintuitive. And I say that just as this is what emerges from the analysis. And I think you'll find it quite fascinating. Again, we're part of a longer series here on YouTube, part of a longer playlist. And according to that YouTube numbering scheme, we're up to now part 10. This particular episode will conclude, I'd say, that the larger preview of the content of Traced section. But we're going to be continuing this series by stepping beyond the book and asking the bigger picture question: how do we know this is true? Take a little bit more of a critical approach and go to the critics themselves to see what they've said and how I might respond to it. And again, the whole reason I bring it up is because I've written this book for a wider audience, and I want more people to read it. And I want to give some of that backstory to say, oh, wow, this is actually a big deal for the creation evolution debate. This is a major scientific discovery that we can rely on. And additionally, because the critics themselves have given us some tremendous gifts that advance the creation science cause. So I think you'll be intrigued by that, regardless of where you stand in the creation evolution debate. Just to re-anchor what we're doing here, we've called this research the new Rosetta Stone of human history. And the thing that corresponds to that new Rosetta Stone is this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity based on the male inherited DNA, based on the Y chromosome. I've done my Y chromosome sequence, or I've sent a sample away to get my Y chromosome sequenced. If you're a male watching, you get your Y chromosome sequence. We can compare our sequences and figure out in short order approximately how many generations ago our common male ancestor lived. For ladies, if you find a male relative, you can do the same sort of thing. And again, for men and women, one person getting a Y chromosome test gives you just one small sliver of the tree. It doesn't tell me my mother's mother, my mother's father, my father's mother's side. It's just this unbroken line of male descent through my father and his father and his father, and on back it goes. This is the key tool we're using to unravel the story of the peoples of history. If you want to see previous episodes in the series, go to our Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, find the playlist tab, and look for Traced DNA's Big Surprise. We're now finishing the section that revolves around the organizing principle for my book. I've got several chapters at the beginning, sort of laying the foundation of, hey, we're going to get into some shocking history, and here's why mathematically it works out, even though intuitively you might say, what? And in today's episode, you might have that reaction as well. But the core of the book is asking the question, let's follow 7 civilizations and ask, who do they come from? What happened to the people after the civilization collapsed? In the last few episodes, again, if you watched us in real time, you know we did about 6 episodes and took a break, then have resumed with this mini section of 4. We're on the 4th one now, the history of the Pacific, and that'll be the last of the 7 civilizations that the book follows. Once again, if you're of Pacific Island descent, I ask you to indulge me for a moment, patience, as I need to give sort of a bigger picture overview for our Western audience. I feel like so many Western people have taken history, world history, yet effectively walk away with a history of Western civilization, not Eastern. I think back to what I learned about the Pacific, and for me, it's growing up as a creationist. Okay, they must have come from someone at Babel, and then there's this big old blank section of time, and then Europeans arrive, and then history proceeds with almost nothing learned about what happened in the Pacific before the Europeans landed on those shores. Part of that omission, I think, in so many of the Western history courses is because the Pacific Islands enter, for example, the U.S. consciousness very late. Looking up some of the details for Pacific, I guess I was surprised to learn, even at this age in life, that Hawaii didn't become a state. Hawaii, a Pacific island, Polynesian people, Hawaii did not become part of the United States until 1959. So when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Japanese did not bomb a U.S. state because it wasn't even a state then. So here, late in U.S. history, the Pacific Islander becomes officially part of what's going on. And I think, again, that's part of the background why when I say Pacific Islander, people might think, oh, isn't that kind of like a vacation destination? There just isn't much the typical Westerner gloms onto when I use that term. There's so little history that's learned in the West about Pacific Islanders. Sure, you talk about Columbus arriving in the New World. He thinks he's in India. He lands in the Caribbean. He's still not in the Pacific. There's others that follow him who keep exploring and going westward. Vasco Nunez de Balboa goes across Panama, lands in what he thinks is the shores of the Indian Ocean. He's still 9,000 miles from China, let alone India, and he's encountering in this vast body of water known as the Pacific Ocean. This is one of the best images I could find to give you a sense for just how vast the Pacific is. Flat maps obscure it. I'll show you one here in a moment, but here's Hawaii. Oh, don't I have my laser pointer? Let's try this again. Here we go. Here's Hawaii. Here's, of course, the United States and California and such. And we're still not seeing really the outline of far eastern lands. The Pacific Ocean is this massive section of our globe. Looks so much smaller when you slam it out into a flat map. Just touch briefly then on the European context history for the Pacific Islands. One of the easternmost groups that I'm going to call part of the Pacific Islander history is Easter Island. Europeans land there. A Dutchman lands there in 1722. Of course, he encounters a people that look foreign to him, archaeology that looks foreign to him, unusual, fantastic. And this island is 2,000 miles away from any known major landmass. Back up a slide here for a moment. The other end that I want to draw your attention to, and this is Easter Island because the Europeans land on Easter Day, is Guam over here. Huge, as the crow flies, distance between the two of them, yet I'm calling all of this, slicing the island here in half of New Guinea, all of this I'm going to include in our discussion of the history of the Pacific. Latent history is when the Europeans arrive. They encounter people foreign to them. They don't have an explanation for who they come from or their stories. And this is what we want to dig into now, using a variety of tools. So if you were with us in our last episode talking about the history of East Asia, we set up the question by looking through the evidence from archaeology, from linguistics, from indigenous histories, these sorts of things. I want to do the same thing for a couple of reasons. One, it helps give, again, context for a Western audience. Number two, this is part of the story that gets inverted in a shocking way by genetics. So I'm setting the stage for two reasons, so hang on to your seatbelts. If we think about the Pacific region from a linguistic perspective, one of the most dominant language families is one we encountered last episode, the Austronesian one. We encountered it because the homelands for Austronesian are thought to have been Taiwan, and part of the Austronesian, the extent of the Austronesian languages includes parts of Southeast Asia, which I included in our discussion of East Asia. But there's a whole other section of it that extends all the way out here to Easter Island. All this is Austronesian. We'll talk about Australia and New Guinea here in a moment. If we think about the Pacific Islanders from a cultural perspective, you've probably heard of the three major groupings: Polynesia, Micronesia, Melanesia. I want to bring in now, like I did for the East Asians, physical characteristics. Again, I'm setting up a story that we're going to turn on its head. It's pretty obvious if you look at Polynesians in terms of their physical characteristics, there's a strong resemblance to East Asians. They have a skin tone, I should say, Polynesians have a skin tone, hair type, hair color that is very characteristic of the Orient, of East Asia. Where the story gets even more complex and interesting is when we think about the wider region of what I'm calling Oceania, that includes Melanesia, and I'm lumping into here for our discussion Australia. If you look at Melanesians and Australian Aborigines, it's clear, number one, they look very different from Polynesians. And number two, they have a significant resemblance to Africans. Skin tone, hair type, hair color. Yes, there are differences, obviously. But if you say, who do they look like most elsewhere in the globe? Sub-Saharan Africans would be a natural choice. So all these lines of evidence together, physical appearances, cultural regions, language, would naturally lead us to conclude perhaps Polynesians and Melanesians had separate origins. And if they had separate origins, perhaps we would be justified at this stage by speculating that perhaps the Polynesians came from East Asians and the Melanesians perhaps have some genetic genealogical connection to Africans. Let's bring in some more detail from archaeology. Based on the earliest archaeological remains, it does indeed look like there were at least two settlings in the Pacific. The Melanesians have some of the earliest archaeological evidence. So just to stop here for a moment, yes, I am using a young Earth creationist framework, and so this would naturally imply some sort of adjustment to radiocarbon, radiometric dates to some of the archaeological sites in the Pacific. And you can see the work of my geology colleagues and physics colleagues for how all that works out. That caveat aside, even if you look at the relative sequence of these dates, it does look like Melanesians, Aborigines were here the earliest in the Pacific. And then later on, the Polynesians followed, or the Polynesians arrived. And archaeologically for the Polynesians, again, thinking some about the linguistic data and the archaeological data does seem consistent with an origin perhaps up here in Taiwan, migration down here through the Philippines, a skirting perhaps without a long period of duration of New Guinea. So there's some contact here then with probably the Melanesians who are there first, but the Polynesians don't necessarily stay in these islands. They keep going and end up, I think by about 900 to 700 BC in Samoa. So mainstream dates, I think, might put the start 3500, 2500 BC. I think those dates will be adjusted. But starting out here in Taiwan, migrating fairly rapidly down here through, rapidly, perhaps over a millennium or so, not over a super slow, long period of time. They get down here to Samoa, and then there's a pause archaeologically. I was somewhat surprised to learn that the colonization of Easter Island, of New Zealand by the Maori, of Hawaii and such, of the Society Islands, happens fairly late in history. Yes, you have archaeological evidence for Polynesians being all the way out here, Samoa, by the last millennium BC, but then apparently they stopped, or at least if they did keep migrating, we don't have archaeological evidence of it. And then just a few centuries before Europeans arrive is when they keep going and they resume it. Again, part of this, one of the world's greatest migrations we've seen. There are Eastern Islanders who end up and go all the way out here after originating, their ancestors originate here, and get to Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific with pre-modern technology. That's an added aspect of this that makes this migration so fantastic. They got that far without the benefits of the technology that maybe the Chinese had or that the Europeans had. They're getting that far. Okay, so again, all these lines of evidence still seem to suggest separate origin for Melanesians from Polynesians. Bring in linguistics once again. Here I've got the Austronesians, not broken up into their various subgroups, but as one gigantic teal section, to contrast then to the language families that we find in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, and in Australia. And once again, I'm focusing on language families. I talk about this more in previous episodes because this seems to be a good rule of thumb to connect people groups to individual men in Genesis 10. We now have genetic data, but I'm going to leave that for last because this, like I said, it inverts the whole story in a wild way. Linguistically, you have perhaps most of Polynesia descending from one group, perhaps arriving in Taiwan after Babel. But based on linguistics, perhaps there were multiple groups that end up in Papua New Guinea and another group perhaps in Australia. So let's think about this then and bring all these lines of evidence together, summarize what we've seen so far apart from genetics, and then bring in this new tool. Based on physical appearances, obvious differences between Polynesians and Melanesians. Based on archaeology, it looks like there's separate timing for their settlings of the islands of the Pacific. We've got language differences between Papua New Guinea, Australia, Polynesians. So multiple lines of evidence, all indicating separate origins, with a natural suggestion of who these different groups of islanders may have come from. Polynesians, the most likely candidate seems to be East Asians of some sort. And for Aborigines, perhaps if not directly from Africans, some sort of connection to them, perhaps. Now, the new Rosetta Stone of human history, this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity. Let's start with the Melanesians. Their echo, their heritage on this tree is fairly straightforward. Most of them, at least in Papua New Guinea, belong to these branches that we're labeling here S, K, and M. The origin of these branches is very deep in history. Again, the dates I'm assigning to these branches are based on the overall young Earth timescale, which in this series you've seen multiple echoes of known human history that show up in this family tree in a manner that you'd expect, which is a testament to the validity of this timescale. Again, in future episodes, we'll talk more about this backstory, but just so you know where these dates are coming from. Ancient origin, consistent with them settling the islands at one of the earliest times. Now, where is it found? Again, the size of these circles represents the relative abundance of these branches in these places on the globe. If you look, and just to give you an example here, if you look at the Philippines at a national level for branch known as K, it's a small circle here. Not that many Filipinos belong to K. If you look at the peoples in the Philippines who have a Melanesian appearance, the Aeta, the Agta peoples, high levels of haplogroup K. And I think it's about 85% or so. Other branches, again, larger circles you find here in New Guinea, in Australia, and very tiny circles elsewhere. And in general, you don't tend to find these lineages elsewhere in the globe. There's some other K up this way that actually might be a quirk of this naming system and may not have the same connection to these guys, but that's another story for another day. Something I was thinking about more after the book was published. The point here is, the conclusion here is, S, K, and M look like the best candidate for the Melanesian lineage. They're ancient in origin. They're found in places where the Melanesians are, where there's this concentration of language families. All this seems to be a good match between archaeological linguistics and genetics. K, M, S, they look like the lineages of these early Melanesians. Now, where things take a twist is if you ask the question, what relationship do these Melanesian lineages have to sub-Saharan Africa? And if you saw the first episode, sort of the 1-hour summary, but also a unique treatment of African history, you might recall that the major sub-Saharan African lineages are haplogroup E, E1B1A in particular, as being a very dominant sub-Saharan African lineage, but A and B as well. These lineages in sub-Saharan Africa have no connection whatsoever to SKNM. Okay, they do have a connection through Noah, but if you want to trace the ancestry of Melanesians back to sub-Saharan Africans, you have to trace the Melanesians back to Shem, go over to his brother Ham, and go back down to these other lineages in sub-Saharan Africa. So despite appearances, the branches of the family tree suggest no connection in that sense, except through the sons of Noah and Noah himself, between these two groups. What about the Polynesians? I think there's about 9 Easter Islanders that I've seen who've been tested for their Y chromosomes, and the data has been published, and all of them so far belong to this haplogroup known as C. I've omitted the New World C. You can find the discussion of that in a previous episode. The Maori in New Zealand, about 50 to 70% of them belong to this haplogroup C. Yes, there are some Melanesians, like the Australian Aborigines, who belong to C, as well as some of the New Guineans. But again, even archaeologically, it does seem like the Polynesians skirted New Guinea, and there was some contact between the two. So no big surprise then that there is some Polynesian and Melanesian connection in this same branch. What I'm going to show you, though, in a moment is a different version of this map that will give us better answers to who did the Polynesians come from. Again, we'd be justified in hypothesizing some sort of link to Northeast Asia, which is where you see some of the largest circles on this map today. Well, it gets even better than that. If you look at the details of Haplogroup C, so I've taken the branch known as Haplogroup C, drilled down into some of the nitty-gritty of when these branches separate and where they're found today. What I want to highlight for you here, it's again another diagram from the book, one of the color plates, is that there's a major separation in branches around 1000 BC. And if you take data from these various groups in East Asia and the Pacific and ask which branch do you belong to, sub-branch do you belong to, something very intriguing emerges. If you look at the sequential order as to when these branches originate, there's a pink one that arises first, then a blue one, then a yellow, then a green. And those correlate to various geographic regions. To summarize a lot of what I've discussed in the book, it looks like Haplogroup C is originally a Siberian Northeast Asian lineage. That in 1000 BC, a subgroup of them decided to go migrating and go through Japan, end up down here in Indonesia. They break into separate groups again. One heads off this way towards India. Another heads in the opposite direction eastward. Another subgroup heads down towards Australian Aborigines. And what's left basically keeps going eastward and ends up giving rise to many Polynesians. I don't have Hawaiians on this map because I haven't yet been able to track down good data for the indigenous Hawaiian people, but I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if there are also high levels of haplogroup C. So far, so good. This seems to fit what we've been saying about the origin of Polynesians. There is this connection to Siberia. One other thing I want to point out, though, sort of a mystery to be solved going forward, is a overlap in dates. So there's some sort of breakup in migration from the region above China that leads to people migrating all over the place, eventually ending up in Easter Island. If you recall our East Asia episode, that's right around the same time the major groups in O broke up. So what's going on in Northeast Asia that so many lineages end up going their separate ways? And this isn't the end of the story. I'll have more to say about this in a moment. This is the only branch we're going to look at. The other thing I want to point out to you is, so yes, Polynesians do appear to go back to some sort of Northeast Siberian Mongolian group. But the timing of the migration, 1000 BC, appears to be later than the migration, or the deep branching structure, of the Melanesians. So this is also consistent with archaeology. This migration, I'm saying, happens 1000 BC, and so they would pass, by the time they're passing New Guinea, you already have Melanesians there. So is that the end of the story? Melanesians come not from Africans, but have a separate origin from Polynesians. And Polynesians come from Northeast Asian Siberians. The end. Here's what gets even more interesting. I want to bring in another branch that's not Polynesian, but is East Asian and contains a key clue that continues to turn this whole story on its head. Haplogroup D, I mentioned very briefly at the end of our East Asian episode, because you can find high levels of it in Tibet. About a third of the Japanese nationally B, and one of the minority groups in Japan, the Ainu, have high levels of haplogroup D. And there's a scattershot here in other regions of East Asia, and I'll talk about this circle here in a moment. First, I want to draw your attention to when the Tibetan and Japanese lineages split. This branch, this diagram is from a color plate in the book. I have other data that I've been able to refer to those since. And the timing of the splits between the Japanese and the Tibetan branches is once again right around 1000 BC, same time as what we saw for the haplogroup C, and same time that we saw for haplogroup O. Is it all part of the same event? What I haven't told you yet is the origin of haplogroup D. Yes, today you can find D in East Asia, Tibet, Japan. Was it originally in Siberia, Yellow River area? This is where it gets rather interesting. Zooming ahead here, and I'm going to get to a specific slide. That large circle that we saw of D down here belongs not to a people of Oriental appearance. Yes, they're Asian, but people who look like dark-skinned sub-Saharan Africans, the great Andamanese, the people of the great Andamanese Islands. They are also part of Haplogroup D, and the timing of their branch, the origin of their branch, is right around the same time. So here, here, and here. I've already said O was probably here. If you watch the East Asia episode, O is probably here from the earliest times. C is up here pre-1000 BC, and there's breakups that happen among these lineages in this part of the ground at the same time, 1000 BC. But what about D? And why is there an African-looking individual on this lineage? The answer comes from looking even deeper in the history of D, which will connect us to C and turn the Polynesian story on its head. We've talked about, at least I talk about it in the book, B and A, and definitely in episode 1 talk about E1B1B and E1B1A. E is almost exclusively sub-Saharan African. The E1B1B branch is heavily North African. It gets somewhat into Europe, but looks like its origin is Northeast Africa among a dark-skinned people group. B and A are among the, here we go, among the dark-skinned peoples of Sudan and the Maasai of Kenya, and also the Bushmen of Southwest Africa. People that look like this. I have a lady here just because this is one of the best images I could find about the features of these people. What I want you to notice at this stage, though, is the Bushmen, though they have hair color and hair type like sub-Saharan Africans, skin tone, perhaps a little bit lighter than your average Nigerian, but still an African, sub-Saharan African skin tone, have an eye shape that looks Oriental. Some of the people groups in Sudan that belong to A, I think belong to A, also have an Oriental eye shape appearance. Your average Nigerian doesn't. Tends to be, again, the Bushmen and people in places where haplogroup A exists. And I'm bringing that up because haplogroup D, which you find at high levels in Japan, high levels in Tibet, among Oriental peoples, have this connection to very dark-skinned peoples. There's this intermingling on the tree of Oriental, East Asian features and African features. Among the branches that connect to these various African and East Asian peoples, you see a mixture of physical features. My point is this, the origin of D is nestled right here within the branches B and A and E. E is clearly an almost, the origin is very clearly sub-Saharan African for E. B and A are a map of B, but B is found throughout at low levels in sub-Saharan Africa. There's an ancestor that D shares with B and A. You look carefully at this diagram, the origin of D is nestled firmly within a whole bunch of sub-Saharan African groups, which implies that it's almost certainly the origin of D itself. Why does D have members who still have an African appearance? Because it looks like on the tree that D was originally African and that it came out of Africa at the very early stages. Some of the people descendants landed in the Andamanese Islands and retained an African appearance. D migrated elsewhere. So this implies that D was perhaps not up here during the breakup of C and O and such, perhaps down here when people went their separate ways. I'm still trying to nail down exactly the migration path. But D ultimately looks like it's African in origin. What does this have to do with Polynesia? Haplogroup C branches off right here. And I think you can make the case that C itself may have come originally from Africa. So how about that? You have all these lines of evidence suggesting Melanesians and Polynesians have separate origins. Genetically, we have results that are consistent with this. But if you then say, well, perhaps the Polynesians came from East Asia and the Melanesians from Africa, you'd have it completely backwards. The Melanesians have no genetic connection to Africa. And even though, yes, the Polynesians more immediately do appear to descend from Siberians, the ultimate origin of C, in the place from whom these haplogroup C Siberians originated, appears to have been Africa itself. It's one of the most remarkable histories that exists in this Y chromosome tree. It changes how we think about race and ethnicity. Black Polynesians, that would almost be an appropriate term for what I've just described. And it's yet one more example of the so-called races changing multiple times in human history. Now, there is still more research to be uncovered. In talking, let me back up a second here and just make a bigger point. Anywhere you go in the globe, you almost are always forced to the conclusion that people are more connected than you think. So, I've been in discussions with East Asians, people of East Asian descent, and the question of how far and wide Melanesians used to be has come up. And we're beginning to wonder and speculate if, in ancient times, Melanesians actually ruled a large swath of this area. And that over time, the Orientals from further north pushed further south, and so that today Melanesians are primarily found over here. Or another way to say this would be, there still are some very intriguing mysteries about the most ancient Pacific Islander, island Southeast Asia regions that I think we can solve with more data from the Melanesians on the globe today. So if you're of Melanesian descent, Polynesian descent, there's really interesting questions left to pursue. And the way to pursue them, if you're interested, even forming perhaps a study group, combining indigenous histories, genetic data, these sorts of things, answersingenesis.org/go/traced. Scroll down the page or click on this button. It'll take you to a spot where you can enter your name, info, message, go straight to my inbox. Love to talk with you. Or if you've taken a genetic test, what does it mean? Love to help you with that as well. This is a preview of this book, Traced. Again, this is the beginning of what will likely be a lifelong research project for me, Lord willing, in which we uncover the hidden history of every people group on Earth. There's some tremendous surprises that have already emerged. There's been some profound confirmations between the biblical-based timescale and known human history. In forthcoming episodes, probably about 5 episodes, we'll talk about the science behind this and the decade-long sequence of research events that have led up to this and how this fulfills predictions I've made prior. The significance of this book will grow as we walk through this data, replacing Darwin, dealing with the larger question of the origin of species. Simpler version of this is replacing Darwin made simple. So stay tuned. You can connect with me also on social media, Facebook, other sites. Would love to chat with you. Again, in the research that starts and Traced is still going and likely will be going, hopefully, Lord willing, for quite some time. The hidden history of the Pacific Islanders, like I said, is one of the most counterintuitive ones that exists. I think it's fascinating, and I hope you'll join me as we keep digging into this history, not just of the Pacific Islands, but all around the globe, hidden history of every people group on Earth.
Well, I love seeing that. That's so fascinating to see how we have all this connectedness, how in reality, as people, we're much more mutt than we like to think we are. And that's not to actually disrespect humanity, but rather to point to the fact that we all go back to Adam and Eve. We're all made in God's image, but we're much more related than we thought we were. In a real sense, that should build unity, how much more connected we should be as humanity because of that relatedness and how real history, real science confirming that biblical history from the beginning. So wonderful to see. I would encourage you guys, if you've not yet read Dr. Jeanson's book called Replacing Darwin, be sure you check that out. It's a phenomenal book. It's so helpful on multiple levels. I've read it through. It's really well done. A lot of science in there to begin with, but lays a good foundation for understanding how genetics and really mutational rates confirms the biblical timescale, biblical truth, and connects to this issue as well. And it also connects really well with, of course, the book Trace we're doing right now, covering really the Rosetta Stone of human history. They go hand in hand. They are two great resources and will give you a good, firm foundation for giving good biblical answers on these issues. And so I've enjoyed these last few shows. Looking forward to the ones to come later on. Hopefully you have as well. And if you want to be part of what Dr. Jeanson is doing and showing these connections, then be sure you contact him. Maybe be a part of this process, making these connections, showing the relatedness of humanity and really glorifying God in that biblical truth starting in Genesis. So it's been a great time together. Looking forward to next time.